So for more on the trade tensions between the U.S. and China, we do want to bring in One America's Emerald Robinson live from the White House. Hi, Emerald. The administration is doubling down on the tariffs against China, with the president asking the U.S. trade representative to look into $200 billion in additional tariffs following China's retaliation to his first of $50 billion. What are you hearing there from the White House about this decision to push forward with more tariffs?
Yeah, so the White House trade advisor, Peter Navarro, briefed reporters saying that the decision was made to do this because China essentially is not coming to the table in these negotiations, saying that there's been no progress made in these high-level talks between China and the U.S., both occurring in China and in the U.S., and that China is not accepting, never accepted the deficit reduction. In addition to that, they've not set up a structure to implement copyright protections, and they're not bringing down those barriers to allow more businesses, outside businesses, to operate in China. And according to Navarro, the president is standing by what he said. He's not backing down on what he wants to see out of these negotiations, no matter how long it takes. And so essentially, he's saying, though, that China will be the biggest loser in this tariff tit for tat, citing the trade deficit, saying that, essentially China exports over $500 billion to the U.S., whereas the U.S. exports only about $100 billion to China. So saying that China only has so far to go in retaliatory measures, and that it will affect their economy much more than the U.S. economy. Greta?
Emerald, okay, Navarro saying there China is the real loser in this situation. So if that's the case, why would China up the ante with retaliatory measures at this point?
Yeah, it was actually an interesting reaction, an interesting decision. And I talked with a Chinese insider who is close to some of President Xi's advisors. And they said that essentially some of his advisors had recommended that he just let this go, this first $50 billion wave of tariffs, that he just essentially turn from that and take it as somewhat of a loss, but in the grand scheme of things, not too big of a hit, but said that it was essentially President Xi's pride that prompted him to react with retaliatory measures. Now, who that's really going to hurt the most still remains to be seen over time. Now, short term could be one thing and long term could be another thing. But essentially, this insider is saying that the Chinese did not expect President Trump to refuse to back down. They expected him to give in, thinking that the U.S. wanted to reach an agreement sooner rather than later, and that the president didn't really have the gusto to wait this out, saying that they're actually very surprised that the U.S. is doubling down on these tariffs. Greta?
Okay, a lot of talk currently about the farmers and the effect that these tariffs will have on them. We know China targeting American soybeans specifically. President says he, though, will take care of the farmers, but is this possibly a risky gamble on the part of the administration and potentially losing a big chunk of the president's support base?
Yeah, so we have heard a lot about the farmers, specifically the soybean farmers. So let's take them for example. When it comes to the soybean market, it questions how fast China might drop these contracts, because there's not a lot of alternatives to go to. They can go look to Argentina or Brazil to buy soybeans, but both of those countries have contracts that extend into 3 years. They're already sold out essentially for 3 years. Also, it's a lot higher cost of production in both of those countries than the U.S., so essentially China would have to pay more for that product. So it remains to be seen. Some in the agricultural community are feeling like China might not cancel these contracts despite the tariffs when they weigh out the costs and benefits. And in addition to that, of course, the president has promised that he will take care of these farmers. That's a huge base for him, and he'll face some of that base in Minnesota when he rallies tomorrow in Duluth. And his administration is looking to pass that farm bill that would serve as a stopgap as this trade negotiations and disagreements continue with China to try to protect those farmers. Greta?
All right, Emerald, another big effect, of course, of these types of tariff moves is Wall Street. The effect on Wall Street. Dow dropping 400 points earlier today, closing down 287 points. But, of course, that doesn't represent that large of a drop when you put that in perspective of percent, down 1.15% at the close today. So is the market responding to these tariffs less drastically this time around?
As far as the
Well, it's again, Greta, it's when you put it into the grand scheme of things and you look at where the numbers have been in the market for so long, a little over a 280-point drop is not that big. So it doesn't seem that the markets are responding in quite a way that some people might have expected it to. And an economist told me that's because as far as U.S. trade to China goes, that hasn't really increased in 2 years, and that's not where economic growth is coming from. So in projecting into the future, that might not worry investors as much. Now, in regards to, let's say that continues to happen every day over the next week and we see drops like that, then that's something for concern. That's something to start looking at and seeing how perhaps the markets might be reacting in a negative way to these tariffs, Greta.
And of course, we know following the history of the market in the recent months, of course, the U.S. economy here at home being a larger focus for investors versus tensions with foreign countries. One more question. If China is not willing to budge and the president is, of course, holding strong as we expect him to, where do we go from here with China?
Well, right now it doesn't look like either side is budging. So, ideally you would hope that they could come to the table and sign a commercial agreement that is beneficial to both countries, that levels the playing field, that promotes economic growth for both countries. But if neither China or the U.S. is willing to budge on that front, and if China doesn't want to create copyright protections or look at bringing down barriers, and that's from so far what we're hearing, they are not looking to do that. Then you kind of have to wonder, are we going in the direction of almost like a Cold War picture where these two major economies operate in different realms of the world? And if that's the case, that doesn't look like that would bode very well for China. But again, it's just waiting to see. You look in the short term and the long term could be two very different things. And in the end, as to which side gives it, it comes down to who feels the burden the most, the American consumers paying more or the Chinese economy taking a big hit. Greta?
All right, One America's Emerald Robinson, they're live from the White House with the latest on these trade tensions between China and the U.S., of course, hitting the markets pretty hard today, down over 280 points. But as we discussed, that's just a 1% drop here, so not as big as it might sound. Thanks so much, Emerald.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube. And call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.